So again, I'm Rachel. I'm the Director of Community Investments at SRE. So good to hear about all of the inspiring work that's happening I feel like there's so much happening in the world and it can be so easy to forget all of the greatness. So thank you for sharing all of that. We're going to jump into a PowerPoint. I want to give two sort of notes before we jump into that PowerPoint. The first is that it is a PowerPoint and I'm going to share my screen, which makes it hard for me to see if you do like the virtual hand raise or if you put a note into the chat. So if you have questions, please feel free to just jump off mute and ask. I'll also open it up at the end, but don't feel shy to interrupt me or interrupt when we're at the slide that we're on. Most of it is going to be going in depth into the RFP, which you can find on our website if you want to like be able to see the RFP while I'm going through it. It'll also be on the slides. And it is a pretty quick presentation. So I actually hope to give you some time back so that with the information fresh in your head, you can either start your LOI, get with your team that's on the call and really sort of have that information with some time to actually put it into your LOI. Give me 1 second to share. Most of you are familiar with SRE as I'm looking over who's on the call, but just as a pretty brief intro, SRE is a Jewish network of 150 plus organizations that are rooted in a shared commitment to safety, respect, and equity for all. We inspire meaningful change in workplaces and communal spaces by bringing people together to address gender-based harassment, discrimination, and inequity. And we do that in 3 ways: our community building, which is really our network weaving, our research and learning. So we put out research ourselves. We also fund research projects. Just about every month we have learning opportunities, usually that are open to anybody that wants to join us about SRE related topics. Quick shout out that we have 2 coming up, one next week on interrupting harassment in the workplace, and then one on April 12th about responding to complaints. So if you want to get involved in either one of those trainings, check out our website and you can RSVP. And then what you're all here to learn more about today is our strategic community investments. And all 3 of those things are really rooted in a shared commitment to an intersectional lens of gender justice. To date, SRE Network has invested nearly $3.75 million in grants and supports to advance safety, respect, and equity with a focus on gender justice. To take you through the timeline, last year in 2021, we invested $940,000 in organizations who are advancing SRE. In 2020, most of our funding was in response to COVID and making sure that SRE remained on the Jewish communal agenda during the pandemic. And so we made $500,000 in grants to prior grantees to stabilize that work. In 2019, we made 16 grants totaling $1.86 million to support field building and internal organizational efforts to support Jewish organizations and their capacity to address SRE at scale. And in 2018, which is really our founding year in the wake of Me Too becoming popularized, we made $500,000 in grants, which were sort of an upfront investment in field building needs and coordinating and scaling programs, developing assessment tools, curriculum, and other resources to support SRE in Jewish communal and workplaces. And I'm excited, outside of those numbers, to introduce you to some of our previous grantees in this video.
The Gender Equity in Hiring Project works to remove gender bias from hiring and employment processes in Jewish organizational life, really to advance our best and most diverse leadership so our entire Jewish community can flourish.
Sacred Spaces works to build healthy Jewish communities by partnering with Jewish institutions to help prevent and respond to sexual abuse and other abuses of power.
So Town Mode is really fundamentally invested in both elevating the question and answering the question. How do we cultivate Jewish communal cultures that are aligned with our values?
With SRE's support, we've been able to launch a national effort to advocate for salary range transparency on job descriptions and advertisements. By organizing across the community around the Jewish values that steer us toward equity for women in all marginalized communities, which is opening the door to really greater transparency around pay in general and leading to the creation of equitable salary banding and compensation philosophies for Jewish organizations.
With SRE's capacity building support, we've reached over 380 institutions and tens of thousands of individuals in 2020 alone. With SRE's emergency COVID response support, we provided hundreds of hours of subsidized or free case consultations to organizations who are responding to new COVID abuses of power or historic instances of abuse that emerged during the pandemic. And with SRE's programmatic support, we will be launching in 2021 KLEAM, a policy toolkit for Jewish workplaces that will be freely accessible to the public for any organization of any size, any type, wherever they may be on their SRE journey.
Do a lot of things. SRE was our foundational support to get this work started through a partnership of the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York and the Good People Fund. So with our SRE support in the last 2 years, we've been able to create unprecedented curriculum, which is delivered as training around positive workplace culture. It's unprecedented because it's through a Jewish lens, focusing on psychological safety and cultures of belonging and accountability, but it's also legally compliant. Those three elements don't exist out there in the world right now. And we do this using tools and frames, interactive practice, and a lot of the hallmarks of what creates cultural training that grounds for people. So we've really created a place to go around these issues, and very much because of SRE.
All right, and then what brings us here today, which is our Spring 2022 Open Grants process. Before we jump in, I wanted to introduce you to our Spring 2022 Open Grants Review Committee. This is also the review committee that we had in fall 2021 for that open process. I think that SRE is so lucky to work with this group of humans. They come from different denominations in the Jewish world. They have organizing and on the ground and activist experience in topics ranging from gender justice itself to reproductive rights, to immigrant rights, to LGBTQ rights. They are lay leaders in the Jewish world and organizational leaders in the Jewish world. They are survivors themselves. They are parents themselves, and they bring what we hope to center in our grant decision-making process, a really strong equity lens. And as we went through the fall 2021 process, there was not a decision that they made that was not rooted in the question about how we could bring equity to the decisions and the organizations that were being impacted by the work that we were doing in the grants pool. And with that, Hava Shervington is on the line with us. She is, of course, having internet challenges because who is not having internet challenges in the last 2 years? But I'd love to give her a chance to share a little bit about what she's looking forward to with this pool and in the selection process. You there, Hava?
I am. Thank you so much. I wanted to really talk about how it was a really moving experience to be a part of this process. During the last cycle, I'm really excited to participate again. One of the things that I was super excited about was there's a lot of conversation around equity and who's left out as we fund different types of programming in the Jewish community, and how do we really bring that lens into this work. And part of that is from us who are doing this grant, who are part of the grant committee process, what we're looking for, what we're thinking about, and kind of really communicating that clearly to people so that they really understand what we find compelling and exciting and interesting when we're looking at projects that get submitted. So I'll just give some of the things that were raised in our last cycle that we're gonna proceed with in this cycle is new ideas or projects for addressing gender justice and using really an intersectional gender justice lens And what we mean by this is, how are you bringing anti-racism lens, disability conscious lens, et cetera, to your gender justice work, not just how can we train people to know about diverse populations within our community. So I just wanted to create clarity on that. Projects that are directly supporting or organizing survivors of abuse in Jewish spaces, projects that are reaching new populations within the Jewish community, and projects that center women's leadership, projects that are led by survivors themselves or organizing survivors, and projects that have identified a specific need within the gender justice / survivor space and are addressing that need through their project. Really looking for people thinking deeply and creatively about how to reach or think about community and who they're reaching and who's being left out of conversations, who's being left out of services that are really important, whose voices need to be uplifted, and how and who is getting support.
Thank you. Questions for Hava? She has kids at home, so it's going to jump off. But if anyone has any questions before that. Cool. Well, thank you, Hava. So appreciate your work on the review committee for being here today. We are going to jump into sort of the nitty gritty of the RFP. I just put a link directly in the chat if it's easier to follow along there, and I will share the slides as well. So we, this spring, are expecting to make a total of $250,000 in 1 to 2 year grants to support organizations that are working on SRE, either through gender justice with an intersectional lens, or supporting victim survivors of sexual harassment or abuse in Jewish spaces. And I want to emphasize that those projects can include actual projects that are led by victims and survivors. And when we say projects, we mean startups, we mean research, we mean general operating funds, we mean multi-org collaborations. We really think of projects as being broad. We anticipate awarding a total of 4 to 6 grants with an average award amount of $50,000 over 2 years. And I want to make 2 points about that. The first is that it is totally fine to break up that $50,000 grant however you want. For example, if you have launch costs and therefore want to apply for more in year 1 than you do in year 2, totally fine. You can also apply for less or more. I will say that we are hoping to fund multiple organizations in this pool. So if you apply for substantially more than that $50,000, you are less likely to be funded, as we want to make sure that lots of organizations are able to receive a meaningful amount. And we do want grant applications to be for 2 years. So please don't apply for $50,000 in a 1 year grant, but you can split that up however you want amongst the 2 years. We got lots of questions last round about what we mean by gender justice with an intersectional lens. And before I jump into the definition that we're using for this RFP, I just want to be totally clear that SRE doesn't think that we know or own the definition for intersectionality or even for gender justice with an intersectional lens, but we do know what we're thinking about or talking about when we're talking about the spring pool and the RFP that we have open right now. And we're referring to projects that acknowledge the ways in which multiple systems of power interlock and intersect to impact those who experience gender-based harm, harassment, abuse, or power differentials. So we're going to prioritize projects that acknowledge and address that in order for your work to include all people of marginalized identities, it also has to have an anti-racist lens. It must promote the full equality of LGBTQ+ people. It must be accessible to people with varied abilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we need to be able to see in your proposal how you've thought about doing that. An example that I've been given permission to share is that we have an organization that represents a mikveh that is considering applying right now. Their mikveh is not accessible to folks who use a wheelchair. And so they're really thinking about how they can take the ritual that is experienced inside this mikveh and move it to a place that will be more accessible to folks who live in wheelchairs. But there's a million examples, and we just want to be able to see in your application process and in the LOI that you submit how you're thinking about how different forms of oppression impact all people who have marginalized gender identities. And if you're struggling with like how you put that into the LOI, it's a great reason to reach out to me and we can have a more full conversation about that. And so that's sort of from the big narrowing down to the small. In order to be eligible to submit a letter of intent, your organization must be located in the US and primarily serve Jewish communities in the US. You must already be a 501c3 or have a current fiscal sponsor. We cannot give you a grant unless your fiscal sponsor is already established at the time of your application. This pool is open to current SRE grantees. If you've had a grant from SRE that's ended, if you've applied to SRE for a grant but were not awarded one, all of those organizations and examples are eligible. We do want to see that you've had a proven commitment to gender justice and gender equity and demonstrated success working on gender justice or victim survivor support in your work. And of course, availability and readiness of your leadership and staff and the other resources that are needed to deliver the effort that you're applying for. Some key dates, and with that, I'll sort of outline the rest of the process. Obviously, you all got the RFP back on March 7th. You're here on March 24th at the Grantseekers workshop. Your letters of interest are due on April 12th. We know that's a super busy time. I wish that we could have scheduled differently. So we do have a built-in 2-day extension. Anybody that submits by the 14th will be considered for funding. It doesn't matter if it's the 12th, the 13th, or the 14th. However, we can't submit because of Passover. We can't accept because of Passover any letters of interest past 4/14. The first round will be a rubric and conversation between the Grants Review Committee. We will use the evaluation criteria on the rubric. We're going to go over that in a second to make determinations about organizations that move to the second round. The second round organizations that move to the second round will be notified the week of May 2nd. You'll also be notified then if you don't make it to the second round. Second round organizations will be invited to a phone call visit or a Zoom visit with someone on our review committee who will ask them questions about your project or your idea. And then the week of June 6th, we will make final notifications about those who have moved from the second round to actually receiving funding. Most grants will be dated from July 1st on, and so you'll get your first disbursement in July of 2022, and then your second disbursement in July of 2023. Even more nitty gritty, like I just mentioned, I like to mention the deadline a lot of times. LOIs are due to me, Rachel, by April 12th, or if you use that extension, April 14th. And they should not exceed 2 pages. We want that for you as organizations for this to be a pretty light lift, and we need that for our review committee too. So please don't exceed the 2 pages. And in those 2 pages, really try to cover your organization name, your contact name, title, and email, your annual operating budget for your organization at large, and then the total amount that you're requesting over 1 and 2 years. And then please break down the 1 or 2 year request, the 1 and 2 year request. The sort of larger questions are, how do you plan to address gender justice with an intersectional lens or offer support to victim survivors? Please explain how your project ensures that all people with marginalized identities are included, or how your project offers victim survivor support. We understand that it's not always easy to identify as a victim survivor or to identify the other victim survivors that are working on your project. We don't need specific names if that doesn't feel safe to you, but we do want to know how your project is being informed by victim survivors themselves. What specific needs in the community do you plan to address? How did you identify those needs? How will you meet those needs? What are the specific short-term, long-term goals in addressing gender justice with an intersectional lens or victim survivor support? The more numbers, the better, including how many people you think will be impacted, how they will be served, et cetera. Who your leaders are and who will be on the ground actually implementing the project that you're talking about in your letter of interest. And then the simple budget of where your grant funds will be allocated for each year. And again, that can be super simple. We've had people write like 4 or 5 lines, and that's totally fine for us in the initial letter of interest. And if we have questions, we'll come back to you and ask. The evaluation criteria, if I was listening to any part of this session, this would be it. The first is the community needs. We want to see that you have experience with diverse Jewish communities, that you've really listened to the community as you put together your letter of interest, what that specific need is for intersectional gender justice projects or victim survivor support, and how your initiative is going to play a part in filling that need. What's new about your idea? What is unique or innovative? How is it responsive? And how are you bringing new offerings to the world of gender justice or victim survivor support? How can you show us the viability of your project? We love, love, love big dreams at SRE, and we want to make sure that you can implement it in the day-to-day. Who is it going to impact? How will you measure that impact? What are your goals, both short and long-term? And then, of course, we root everything at SRE in SRE. So we want to see safety, respect, and equity in the center of your letter of interest. And if I could bold anything second besides the letter of interest due date, which is April 12th, the second is that if you have not met with anyone on the SRE team to talk about your idea, I highly recommend doing it. We can let you know as you put a letter of interest in front of the review committee how to strengthen it so that you can have the strongest proposal going into the process as possible. I love to share ideas and learn about the ideas that you already have. So please send me an email and set up a time before the 12th to go over your idea with me if you haven't done so already. And especially if your organization is applying to SRE for the first time or has not worked with SRE in any other way before. And that is all. Questions, any way in which I can be helpful? Good, I feel like that's a good sign. If there are no questions, I promise you some time back. You've got 20 minutes to work on your LOIs. Again, please email me if questions do come up. If you haven't talked to me before about your idea, I'm always around. Shayna the All-Star put my email address in the chat, rachel@srenetwork.org. I'm around over the next few weeks a ton to meet with orgs that are applying for this process. And I look forward to reading your letters of interest.
Rachel, there is one question before we go from Rona in the chat.
So we were just curious if there was any preference for like a partnership, a project, you know, with partnerships versus a single organization taking on a project.
Got it, thank you. No preference, we've seen both be funded. I think it actually depends on the idea more than whether or not it's multiple organizations coming together versus one doing the work.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions before I let you go? All right, looking forward to being in touch and thanks y'all for being here.